"If you can dance this waltz, you can marry my son." The words echoed through the grand ballroom like thunder, but nobody expected what happened next. Margaret Washington stood at the edge of the Crystal Bay Country Club's most exclusive event, her black server's uniform a sharp contrast against the ocean of silk gowns and glittering jewels. At 19, she had worked at this club for 2 years, invisible to the wealthy elite who gathered here every weekend. But tonight was different. Tonight, a single dance would either destroy her dreams forever or make her the most powerful woman in Virginia. The annual Sterling Foundation Gala was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, where the richest families in Virginia mingled, sipped champagne, and made deals worth millions. Margaret moved through the crowd with practiced grace, refilling glasses and clearing plates, her presence barely acknowledged by the guests who saw her as part of the furniture. But Margaret harbored a secret that would shatter every assumption in that room. Victoria Sterling, the matriarch of the Sterling family empire, stood at the center of it all. At 65, she commanded attention wherever she went. Her silver hair was pulled into an elegant chignon, her navy Chanel suit impeccable, her diamond necklace worth more than most people's homes. Victoria had built a pharmaceutical fortune alongside her late husband, and now controlled one of the most powerful families on the East Coast. Her son, David Sterling, stood beside her looking uncomfortable in his tailored tuxedo. At 32, David was everything his mother wanted in an heir: Harvard-educated, successful, and handsome. But he had one problem that drove Victoria to distraction. He couldn't find a wife worthy of the Sterling name. "David, darling," Victoria's voice carried that sharp edge that made servants scatter. "The Patterson girl is available for the next dance. Her father owns half of downtown Richmond." David sighed, his hazel eyes scanning the ballroom. "Mother, we've discussed this. I'm not interested in arranged marriages based on bank accounts." Victoria's laugh shattered like crystal hitting marble. "Don't be naive, sweetheart. Love is a luxury. Marriage is business. The sooner you understand that, the better." What Victoria didn't know was that her son had been watching Margaret all evening. David had noticed Margaret months ago. Yes, she was stunning. Those warm brown eyes that sparkled with hidden fire, that radiant smile that could light up shadows. But it was her razor-sharp intelligence that truly captivated him. He'd overheard her discussing quantum physics with one of the club's maintenance staff, speaking 3 languages fluently with international guests, and solving complex scheduling problems that stumped the management. Margaret was extraordinary, but in his mother's world, her skin color and social status made her invisible. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and couples began flowing onto the dance floor like water finding its level. Margaret continued her work, weaving between dancers with champagne flutes on her tray, when suddenly she found herself face to face with Mrs. Richmond Patterson, Victoria's closest friend and social competitor. "Excuse me, girl." Mrs. Patterson's voice dripped with condescension. "You nearly spilled champagne on my Oscar de la Renta gown." Margaret stopped, her heart racing. She hadn't come close to spilling anything, but contradicting a guest meant immediate termination. "I apologize, ma'am. It won't happen again." Mrs. Patterson's eyes glittered with malice. She was known for tormenting staff members, particularly Black employees, finding excuses to get them fired. "Victoria, dear." She called out loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Perhaps it's time this club reconsidered its hiring standards. Some people simply don't belong in refined environments." The conversation around them gradually stopped. All eyes turned to Margaret. Victoria approached with the predatory grace of a shark, sensing blood in the water. Her pale blue eyes assessed Margaret like she was examining a flawed piece of merchandise. "Is there a problem here?" Mrs. Patterson smiled sweetly, the expression never reaching her eyes. "Oh, nothing serious. Just a reminder that certain standards should be maintained. After all, we can't have just anyone handling our affairs." Margaret felt molten fury rise in her cheeks, her grandmother's voice whispering, "Hold your head high." But she kept her voice steady as steel. "Ma'am, I've worked here for 2 years without a single complaint. I take pride in my service." "Pride?" Victoria's eyebrows rose mockingly. "How fascinating. Tell me, dear, what exactly do you take pride in? Carrying trays, cleaning glasses?" The crowd began to murmur, some guests pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming an entertaining spectacle. Margaret felt trapped, surrounded by faces that ranged from amused to openly hostile. She was about to become another viral video of a Black service worker being humiliated by wealthy white patrons. But then David stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Actually, Mother, I think we should discuss what real pride means." Victoria turned to her son, surprised by his intervention. "David, this doesn't concern you." "Doesn't it?" David's voice carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. "You've spent the entire evening telling me about the importance of finding someone worthy of our family name, someone with grace, intelligence, and dignity. Well, I've found her." He walked directly to Margaret, extending his hand with the same courtesy he would show any guest. "Miss Washington, would you honor me with this dance?" Margaret stared at his outstretched hand, knowing that accepting would change everything. Around them, the silence crashed like a thunderclap. Victoria's face drained of color, shock and rage warring in her pale blue eyes. Mrs. Patterson looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. The entire ballroom waited for her response. I'm working, Mr. Sterling," Margaret whispered. David smiled, his eyes kind and encouraging. "The most important work any of us can do is standing up for what's right. Please, dance with me." Margaret set down her tray, her hands trembling not with fear, but with the electric thrill of finally being seen, and accepted his offer. As they moved onto the dance floor, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, whispers following in their wake. That's when Victoria Sterling spoke the words that would either crown Margaret as a queen or bury her alive. Her voice rang out across the ballroom, sharp and clear as crystal. "How amusing. David, since you're so confident in your choice, let me make this interesting. This young woman wants to dance? Fine, but dancing requires skill, not just the ability to sway back and forth." Victoria's smile was razor sharp as she continued. "I'll make you a deal, dear. If you can dance a proper Viennese waltz, not some simple box step, but a real waltz with all the traditional figures, then perhaps we'll discuss your qualifications. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll resign your position immediately and never set foot in this club again." The trap was set, and everyone knew it. The Viennese waltz was notoriously difficult, requiring years of training to master. It wasn't just about following music. It demanded precise footwork, perfect timing, and an understanding of complex patterns that most people never learned. Victoria was certain she'd found the perfect way to humiliate both Margaret and her son while maintaining her reputation as a gracious hostess. Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together gleefully. "Oh, how delightful. A little entertainment before dinner." Other guests began placing bets, their voices carrying cruel amusement. 500 says she trips within 30 seconds. "I'll take that bet, she won't last 15. This is better than the Kentucky Derby. Margaret felt her chest tighten with anxiety. She'd never learned formal ballroom dancing. Her knowledge of dance came from church socials and family gatherings, nothing like the sophisticated choreography Victoria was demanding. But David squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Trust me," he whispered. "I've got you." Victoria raised her hand to signal the orchestra. "Maestro, if you please. The Blue Danube in proper Viennese tempo. 3 minutes, no stopping, no simplification." The conductor nodded, raising his baton. The opening notes of Johann Strauss's most famous waltz filled the air, that distinctive 1-2-3 rhythm that had graced ballrooms for over a century. Couples on the dance floor stepped aside, creating a large circle around Margaret and David. And then something magical happened. As the music swelled, Margaret felt something awaken inside her. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Child, music lives in your bones. Let it speak through you." Margaret had grown up surrounded by rhythm, gospel hymns on Sunday mornings, jazz records in her father's workshop, the complex polyrhythms of her African heritage that pulsed through family celebrations. She began to move, and the entire ballroom gasped. What the crowd didn't know was that Margaret had been secretly studying, her heart aching with dreams too big for her circumstances. For months, she had stayed after closing to watch the dance classes held in the ballroom. Hidden behind service doors, she had memorized every step, every turn, every subtle gesture. Her body had learned the language of the waltz without ever setting foot on the dance floor. Tonight, all those stolen moments of observation were finally put to use. Margaret didn't just follow David's lead. She became one with the music itself. Her feet found the intricate patterns as if she'd been dancing them her entire life. The chassé, the fleckerels, the promenades, every figure flowed seamlessly into the next. Her server's uniform transformed from a symbol of servitude into flowing evening wear as she spun and glided across the marble floor. David stared at his partner in amazement. He had expected to guide her through basic steps, maybe help her survive Victoria's challenge with dignity and tact. Instead, he found himself struggling to keep up with Margaret's natural grace and perfectly executed technique. The vultures fell silent, their cruel laughter dying as they witnessed something extraordinary. Margaret moved like she was born for this moment. Her every gesture radiated elegance and confidence. She executed complex figures that some of the club's members had never mastered despite years of expensive lessons. The waltz became a conversation between two souls, expressing through movement what words could never capture. But Victoria Sterling was far from finished with her games. As the first song drew to a close, Victoria stepped forward with a sharp clap of her hands. "Lovely. But any amateur can get lucky with one dance. True mastery requires versatility." She turned to the orchestra with a predatory smile. "Maestro, let's try something more. Challenging. La Comparsita. Argentine tango. Authentic tempo." The crowd stirred like hungry wolves, scenting fresh blood in the air. Tango was a completely different animal from the waltz. Where the waltz was about grace and flow, tango demanded passion, precision, and perfect partnership. It was a dance of seduction and power, requiring an intimate connection between partners that went far beyond mere technique. Margaret felt a moment of panic. Tango was one dance she hadn't been able to study in secret. The classes were held during her shifts, and she'd only caught glimpses of the complex footwork and dramatic poses. But then she looked into David's eyes and saw something that changed everything. "I've got you," he repeated, his voice barely audible over the opening notes of the tango. Just feel the music. Feel me. Everything else will follow. The bandoneon's haunting melody filled the air, that distinctive sound that could make hearts race and souls weep. Margaret took a deep breath and let herself trust completely in this man she barely knew, but who had risked everything to defend her dignity. What happened next left everyone speechless. Margaret and David didn't just dance the tango, they embodied it. Their bodies moved as one entity, her legs sliding along his in perfect akos, their frames maintaining the precise posture that the dance demanded. The dramatic pauses, the sharp head snaps, the way Margaret's leg wrapped around David's in a perfect gancho. Every movement was poetry in motion. The audience was no longer entertaining themselves with others' potential failure. They were witnessing artistry. Mrs. Patterson's mouth hung open in shock. Other guests lowered their phones, too mesmerized to remember they were recording. Even the orchestra members began to smile, their playing inspired by the passionate performance unfolding before them. But the real shock was yet to come. As the tango reached its climactic end, with Margaret in a dramatic backbend, supported by David's strong arms, the ballroom exploded like a dam bursting. Years of suppressed admiration flooding free, drowning Victoria's cruelty in thunderous approval. Not the polite, measured clapping typical of country club events, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation for what they had witnessed. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, her carefully laid trap having backfired spectacularly. She had intended to humiliate Margaret and teach her son a lesson about knowing his place. Instead, she had inadvertently provided a stage for Margaret to reveal her extraordinary talent to everyone who mattered in their social circle. "Brava!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Magnificent!" David helped Margaret return to standing position, both of them breathing heavily from the exertion and emotion of their performance. Margaret's eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall, while David looked at her with wonder and something deeper, something that looked very much like love. And that's when Victoria Sterling played her final card. "Very impressive." Victoria's voice cut through the applause like a blade. "But dancing is just one skill among many. A Sterling wife needs more than the ability to move gracefully. She needs breeding, education, social connections that matter." Her voice grew louder, more vicious. "Tell me, dear, where did you attend university? Which finishing school taught you proper etiquette? What charity boards have you served on? What cultural institutions bear your family's name?" The questions hung in the air like poison, designed to wound and humiliate. Victoria continued her attack. "You may dance beautifully, but you're still just a server who learned to mimic her betters. Talent without pedigree is merely entertainment, not marriage material for a family like ours." Margaret felt each word like her grandmother's switch across her knuckles. Sharp, intended to break her spirit, but only making her stronger. Everything Victoria said was true by the standards of this world. Margaret came from a working-class family in Richmond's East End. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a nurse. She was paying her way through community college by working multiple jobs, including this one at the country club. But David Sterling had heard enough. "Mother." His voice was quiet but carried the authority of a man who had finally found his backbone. "You want to talk about breeding? About what really matters in a person?" He turned to address the entire ballroom, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Margaret Washington is a full-time student, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working 3 jobs to pay for her education. She speaks 4 languages fluently and volunteers at the Children's Hospital every Sunday morning. She's studying biochemistry, and plans to develop affordable medications for underserved communities. The crowd began to murmur with surprise and growing respect. David continued, his voice filled with pride. But more than any of that, she has something that money can't buy, and breeding can't guarantee. She has character. She has dignity. She faces every challenge with grace and handles every insult with more class than most people in this room have ever shown. He took Margaret's hand and looked directly at his mother. You asked about qualifications for being a sterling wife? Margaret is more qualified than anyone I've ever met. She's intelligent, compassionate, hardworking, and beautiful inside and out. And then David Sterling did something that no one saw coming. He dropped to one knee right there on the dance floor, in front of 300 of the most influential people in Virginia. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a ring box. Not his grandmother's family heirloom, that Victoria had been saving for his future bride, but something he had purchased himself months ago, carried with him every day, waiting for the perfect moment. Margaret Washington, his voice carried across the silent ballroom. Will you marry me? The ring blazed under the crystal chandeliers like a fallen star demanding attention. But it was nothing compared to the shock radiating through the ballroom. Margaret stared down at David, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Little girls from the East End didn't get fairy tale proposals. They got broken promises and empty dreams. 3 hours ago, she had been invisible, just another black face in a white uniform serving drinks to people who looked through her like she was air. Now she stood at the center of the most exclusive social event in Virginia, being proposed to by one of the state's most eligible bachelors. David, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunderous silence. The silence stretched like a blade poised to cut, every heartbeat thunderous in the crystal stillness. 300 pairs of predatory eyes devoured every detail, every micro-expression, phones raised to capture this moment that would be dissected on social media for weeks to come. Margaret could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Not just her own history, but the collective memory of every Black woman who had ever been told she wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy, didn't belong. Victoria Sterling's face cycled through rage like a storm system. White shock, purple fury, then cold calculation. Her hands trembled with rage as she struggled to process what her son had just done. In front of the Patterson family, in front of the Weatherbys and the Ashfords and the Montgomerys, every family name that mattered in Virginia society. Get up, Victoria hissed at her son. Get up this instant before you embarrass us further. But David remained on one knee, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. The only thing that would embarrass me is if I let fear keep me from the best decision I've ever made. Mrs. Patterson recovered first, her voice cutting through the tension like a rusty blade. Victoria, surely you're not going to allow this spectacle to continue? Think of what people will say. Let them talk, David replied, rising slowly to his feet while keeping the ring box open. Margaret, I know this is sudden. I know the circumstances are overwhelming. But I've been watching you for months, and I've never met anyone like you. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs like freedom fighting against cage bars, wild, desperate, demanding to be heard. This was insane. She barely knew this man beyond polite exchanges when she served his table. Yet something in his eyes spoke of sincerity, of a depth of feeling that seemed impossible given their brief interactions. David, you don't understand what you're asking, Margaret said softly. Your world and mine, they don't mix. This proposal, it's not just about us. It's about everything, your family, your business, your entire future. Victoria seized the opening like a predator sensing weakness. Finally, someone with sense, Victoria declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. At least the girl understands her place, even if my son has temporarily lost his mind. She stepped closer to Margaret, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You think this is some fairy tale, don't you? Cinderella at the ball. But real life isn't a Disney movie, dear. If you accept that ring, I will strip away everything you've ever worked for, piece by bloody piece, until you're begging to go back to the shadows where you belong. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when facing racism disguised as propriety. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't alone. Mother David's voice carried a warning that made several nearby guests step back. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. Victoria's laugh shattered like crystal hitting marble. Oh, you suggest? How adorable. David, you may be 32 years old, but you're still my son, and more importantly, you still depend on the Sterling family trust for your lifestyle. She turned to address the crowd, playing to her audience with practiced skill. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unfortunate display. My son is clearly going through some sort of crisis. Perhaps too much champagne, perhaps the stress of managing our pharmaceutical division. But I assure you, this momentary lapse in judgment will be corrected. The crowd murmured agreement, relief washing over faces that had been unsure how to react to the unprecedented social breach they were witnessing. But Margaret Washington had heard enough. Mrs. Sterling Margaret's voice rang out clear and strong, silencing the whispers. You want to talk about judgment? Let's talk about the judgment of a woman who measures human worth by bank account balances and skin color. Victoria's eyes became Arctic ice, beautiful, deadly, and capable of destroying everything they touched. How dare you? How dare I? What? Speak the truth? Margaret stepped forward, her server's uniform somehow transforming into armor through sheer force of will. How dare I point out that your son sees something in me that has nothing to do with money or status or the color of my skin? The ballroom fell silent again, but this silence felt different. Electric, dangerous. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You think I don't belong in your world? Thank God. Your world is built on the bones of people like my ancestors. I'm not here to join it. I'm here to change it. She turned to David, her eyes shining with unshed tears and fierce determination. David Sterling, you are a good man. You're kind and generous and brave enough to stand up for what's right even when it costs you. Any woman would be lucky to have you propose to her. David's face lit up with hope, but Margaret wasn't finished. But I can't accept your ring, not like this. Not as some sort of rebellion against your mother or statement about social justice. If we're going to do this, literally, if we're going to even consider doing this, it has to be real. It has to be about us, not about proving a point. The crowd exhaled collectively, disappointment and relief warring on their faces. Victoria smiled triumphantly. Well, that's settled then. David, put that ridiculous ring away, and I'm not finished, Margaret interrupted, her declaration cutting through the air. Mrs. Sterling, you want to make this about qualifications? About what it takes to be worthy of your family name? Fine. Let's make this interesting. Margaret Washington was about to change the game entirely. I propose a wager, Margaret announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom like a bell. Give me 6 months. 6 months to prove that I belong in your world, not because I've changed who I am, but because your world needs to change. Victoria's eyebrows rose mockingly. A wager? How quaint. And what exactly are you proposing to prove, dear? Everything you think I can't do. Margaret's chin lifted with the defiance of queens facing guillotines. Proud, unbroken, magnificent in her refusal to bow. You think I can't handle your social circles? I'll attend every charity gala, every board meeting, every cultural event this city has to offer. You think I don't understand business? I'll learn your pharmaceutical company inside and out. You think I can't hold my own with your intellectual elite? Test me. The crowd stirred like hungry wolves scenting fresh blood in the air. This was better than any reality show. And if I fail, Margaret continued, if after 6 months I haven't proven myself worthy by your standards, I'll disappear from your son's life forever. I'll quit my job here, transfer to a college in another state, and you'll never see me again. Victoria's eyes glittered with predatory interest. And if you succeed? If I succeed, you give us your blessing. You welcome me into your family with the same respect you'd show any other woman David chose to marry. And you publicly apologize for your behavior tonight. The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly. Several guests began placing new bets, their earlier cruelty forgotten in the excitement of this unprecedented social drama. David stepped forward, alarm written across his features. Margaret, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Yes, I do, Margaret replied softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Not for your mother, not for these people, for me. I need to know that I can stand in this world as an equal, not as someone who needs protecting or defending. She turned back to Victoria, extending her hand like a duelist offering terms. Do we have a deal, Mrs. Sterling? Victoria Sterling stared at the outstretched hand like it was a snake offering poison. Knowing that accepting meant swallowing her pride, refusing meant admitting she was a liar. The smart play was to refuse, to end this spectacle immediately, and deal with her son's rebellion privately. But Victoria hadn't built a pharmaceutical empire by backing down from challenges, and this particular challenge offered her something irresistible. The chance to destroy this upstart girl so thoroughly that David would never consider crossing social lines again. 6 months, Victoria repeated thoughtfully. And you believe you can master in half a year what takes most people a lifetime to learn. I believe I can show you that what you call breeding is just centuries of inherited cruelty dressed up as sophistication. Margaret replied, Real class can't be taught, Mrs. Sterling. Either you have it or you don't. The insult was delivered so smoothly that it took a moment for its impact to register. Victoria's face flushed with anger, but she maintained her composure. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. Very well, Victoria said finally, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I accept your wager. 6 months to prove you belong. But let's make this truly interesting, shall we? She paused dramatically, ensuring she had everyone's attention. If you fail, Liz, when you fail, you don't just disappear from David's life. You publicly admit that you were wrong, that breeding and social standing do matter, and that some barriers exist for good reason. You'll stand in this very ballroom and tell everyone here that you overestimated yourself and that I was right all along. The terms were harsh, designed to maximize humiliation. Margaret felt the weight of every gaze in the room, knowing that accepting would put her dignity, her pride, and her future on the line. And if I succeed? She asked quietly. Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. If you succeed, which you won't, I'll not only give you my blessing, I'll fund your education through medical school and give you a seat on the Sterling Foundation board. The offer was so generous it had to be a trap. Margaret understood immediately. Victoria was so confident in her inevitable failure that she could afford to be magnanimous. The pharmaceutical heiress had no doubt that a working-class black girl from Richmond's East End would crumble under the pressure of high society expectations. But Victoria Sterling had seriously underestimated Margaret Washington. I accept, Margaret said, grasping Victoria's perfectly manicured hand in her own work call used one. 6 months. The handshake lasted 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds sealed a war that would reshape Virginia society forever. Phones flashed as the moment was captured from every angle, destined to become viral content within hours. David looked between the two women with growing concern. This is insane. Margaret, you don't have to. Yes, she does, Victoria interrupted smoothly. The terms are set. 6 months from tonight, we reconvene here to see if your little Cinderella has truly transformed into princess material. She turned to address the crowd one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the most entertaining social experiment Virginia has seen in decades. Place your bets accordingly. The orchestra, sensing the drama had reached a natural pause, struck up a light waltz to signal the return to normal festivities. But nothing about this evening would ever be normal again. Margaret found herself surrounded by curious guests, some offering encouragement, others barely concealing their skepticism. Mrs. Patterson approached with the predatory grace of a shark. My dear, she said, her voice honey-sweet with venom, I do hope you understand what you've gotten yourself into. Victoria Sterling doesn't lose. Ever. But Margaret Washington had grown up in a world where losing meant death. Every scholarship, a battle. Every opportunity, a war. Every moment of respect, paid for in blood, sweat, and tears that would drown lesser souls. She had fought for every scholarship, every opportunity, every moment of respect she'd ever received. This challenge was just another mountain to climb, another barrier to break through. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret finally found herself alone with David in a quiet corner of the ballroom. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "This got completely out of hand. You shouldn't have to prove anything to anyone." Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed all evening. "David, I'm not doing this for your mother. I'm not even doing it for you. I'm doing it for my grandmother who scrubbed floors for women like you, mother. For my mother who was told she wasn't nurse material. For every little black girl who's been taught to make herself smaller so white people feel comfortable." She reached up and touched his cheek gently. "And maybe, just maybe, I'm doing it for us. Because if we're going to have any kind of future together, I need to know I can stand beside you as an equal, not as someone you have to defend." David covered her hand with his own. "You're already more than equal to anyone in this room. Then I shouldn't have any trouble proving it." Margaret replied with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. As they walked toward the exit, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the ballroom's mirrored walls. The young woman looking back at her still wore a server's uniform, but something fundamental had changed. The girl who had entered this ballroom 3 hours ago would never have dared to challenge Victoria Sterling. But the woman leaving was ready for war. The 6 months stretched ahead like an obstacle course designed by her enemies. Margaret would have to navigate charity galas where she was the only black face in the crowd, board meetings where her every word would be scrutinized for signs of inadequacy, and social events where one wrong fork could be used as evidence of her unworthiness. But Margaret Washington had never backed down from a fight, and she wasn't about to start now. As David walked her to her car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that looked embarrassingly out of place among the Bentleys and Maseratis in the parking lot, Margaret felt the weight of what she had committed to settle on her shoulders. 6 months to prove she belonged in a world that had spent centuries keeping people like her out. 6 months to show that worth wasn't measured in stock portfolios or family trees. 6 months to either claim her place at the table or be humiliated so thoroughly that she'd never recover. The war for Margaret Washington's future was about to begin. 3 weeks later, Margaret Washington stood in front of her bedroom mirror at 5:30 a.m., preparing for the battle of her life. The woman staring back at her had buried the scared girl who once served champagne to people who treated her like furniture. Gone was the server's uniform, replaced by a tailored navy blazer and pencil skirt that had cost her an entire month's salary. Her natural hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, her makeup subtle but flawless. She looked the part of a young professional, but looking the part and being accepted were two very different things. Today was the first test, the Sterling Pharmaceutical Board meeting. Victoria had wasted no time implementing her strategy to destroy Margaret. Within days of their wager, she had arranged for Margaret to attend the monthly board meeting as an observer, a position that would expose her to the company's most influential stakeholders, while ensuring she had no real voice or protection. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David. "You don't have to do this. We can call the whole thing off." But calling it off was never an option. Margaret had spent the last 3 weeks preparing like a general planning a military campaign. She had read every financial report Sterling Pharmaceutical had published in the past 5 years, memorized the names and backgrounds of all 15 board members, and studied pharmaceutical industry trends until her eyes burned. Her small apartment looked like a war room, with charts and graphs covering every surface. Each mile felt like marching deeper into hostile territory, where her skin color was a target painted on her back, past mansions that cost more than her family would earn in 10 lifetimes. Each mile felt like crossing into enemy territory, where her skin color and background made her an immediate target. The Sterling building thrust 30 floors into the sky like a concrete middle finger to everyone who wasn't born rich and white. Margaret had never entered through the front doors before. Every step on that marble felt like walking on the backs of her ancestors who built this wealth but never got to enjoy it. During her background research phase, she had delivered catering supplies to the service entrance, invisible to the executives who made decisions worth millions. Today, she walked through the marble lobby like she belonged there, even though every instinct screamed that she was an imposter. Miss Washington, the receptionist's voice carried barely concealed surprise. Despite her professional appearance, Margaret's presence in the executive lobby clearly confused the woman. I'll need to see some identification. 3 white men in expensive suits sailed past her like she was invisible, again. The familiar sting of being seen as suspicious while they moved through the world wrapped in privilege. Margaret handed over her driver's license with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm here for the board meeting. The receptionist's confusion deepened as she checked her computer. Yes, you're on the list. Mrs. Sterling's guest. The elevator to the executive floor is to your right. As Margaret rode the elevator to the 30th floor, she practiced the breathing techniques her grandmother had taught her for managing anxiety. When you're the only one who looks like you in the room, her grandmother had said, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing all of us who never got the chance. The boardroom was everything Margaret had expected and worse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered commanding views of the city, while an enormous mahogany table dominated the space. Oil paintings of Sterling family patriarchs stared down from the walls like disapproving judges. 15 of Virginia's most powerful executives were already seated, their conversations dying as Margaret entered. Victoria Sterling sat at the head of the table like a queen holding court. Her silver hair impeccably styled, her burgundy Armani suit radiating authority. She looked up as Margaret approached, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. Gentlemen, Victoria announced. I'd like you to meet Miss Margaret Washington, my son's friend. She'll be observing today's proceedings as part of her education in corporate governance. The emphasis on friend was subtle but deliberate, designed to diminish Margaret's status while maintaining plausible deniability. Around the table, 14 men, all white, all over 50, assessed her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Margaret took the single empty chair at the far end, the defendant's seat at her own trial, surrounded by a jury that had already decided her guilt. She could feel every gaze cataloging her appearance, her demeanor searching for signs of inadequacy they could later discuss over drinks at their exclusive clubs. Now then, Victoria continued, let's begin with quarterly earnings. Richard Ashford, the CFO, launched into a presentation about profit margins and market penetration. Margaret listened like her life depended on it, because it did. Every word was ammunition, every number a weapon she might need. She had memorized these figures, but hearing them in this room, surrounded by predators in suits, revealed the blood behind the numbers. 20 minutes into the presentation, Victoria struck. Miss Washington, she said sweetly, you seem very attentive. Perhaps you have some observations about our Q3 performance. The room fell silent like a morgue, every executive holding their breath, waiting for her to stumble. 14 pairs of hostile eyes locked onto Margaret like rifle scopes, finding their target. This was the trap Victoria had been setting from the moment Margaret walked in, a chance to expose her ignorance in front of the most influential people in the company. But Margaret Washington had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Actually, Mrs. Sterling, I do have some observations, Margaret replied, her voice steady and controlled. Your Q3 numbers show strong performance in traditional markets, but there's a concerning trend in your generic drug division. Richard Ashford's eyebrows rose in surprise. Victoria's smile turned into a death mask, beautiful, frozen, and hiding the rage beneath. Margaret continued, consulting her notes with practiced confidence. Generic revenues dropped 12% quarter over quarter, primarily due to increased competition from overseas manufacturers. However, your research and development spending remained focused on lifestyle medications rather than addressing the generic gap. The silence in the room shifted from skeptical to attentive. Furthermore, Margaret pressed on, sensing an opening. Your market research indicates a growing demand for affordable medications in underserved communities, a demographic that Sterling Pharmaceutical has largely ignored. The profit margins might be smaller, but the volume potential is enormous, and the social impact could significantly improve your corporate image. She looked directly at Victoria as she delivered her final point. Funny how the most profitable strategies are often the ones that don't require stepping on poor people's necks to reach higher shelves. The dig was subtle but unmistakable. Richard Ashford leaned forward, genuine interest replacing his earlier skepticism. Miss Washington, those are fascinating insights. Have you worked in pharmaceutical marketing? No, sir. I'm currently studying biochemistry with a focus on developing affordable medications. I've been researching market gaps in pharmaceutical accessibility as part of my thesis work. Victoria's face remained composed, but Margaret caught the flash of anger in her eyes. How academic, Victoria said dismissively. Of course, theoretical knowledge and practical business experience are quite different things. Running a pharmaceutical company requires understanding market realities, not idealistic notions about helping people. Board member Thomas Weatherby spoke up unexpectedly. Actually, Victoria, the young lady makes some valid points. Our ESG scores have been taking a hit lately, and institutional investors are increasingly concerned about social responsibility metrics. Margaret felt hope blaze in her chest like wildfire, dangerous, uncontrollable, and spreading fast. Thomas, surely you're not suggesting we restructure our entire business model based on a college student's thesis project? Victoria's laugh was musical and cutting. Miss Washington, perhaps you could share with us your thoughts on FDA approval processes, or international patent law, or the complexities of clinical trial management. Each question was designed to expose the limits of Margaret's knowledge, to remind everyone in the room that studying textbooks was vastly different from running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But Margaret had learned something important in the past 3 weeks. Sometimes the best defense was no defense at all. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Sterling, Margaret said with disarming honesty. I don't have practical experience in those areas. But I'm here to learn, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to observe how successful executives navigate these complexities. The response was pure class. Victoria's attacks suddenly looked like what they were, a rich woman bullying someone half her age. Several board members exchanged glances, their expressions suggesting they were reassessing their initial impressions. Victoria realized she had just handed her enemy a sword and pointed it at her own throat. Attacking a young woman who was clearly intelligent and eager to learn made her look like a bully rather than a protective mother. The meeting continued for another hour, with Margaret contributing thoughtful questions and observations when appropriate. She asked about patent cliff strategies, inquired about emerging market opportunities, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of pharmaceutical industry dynamics that impressed several board members despite herself. As the meeting concluded, Richard Ashford approached Margaret with a business card. Miss Washington, I'd be interested in reading your thesis when it's completed. Your perspective on affordable medication access is exactly the kind of fresh thinking our industry needs. Victoria watched this interaction with barely concealed fury. Other board members offered similar encouragement as they filed out, several expressing genuine interest in Margaret's academic work and pharmaceutical insights. What was supposed to be a humiliating exposure of her inadequacy had instead become an opportunity to showcase her intelligence and potential. As the boardroom emptied, Victoria and Margaret found themselves alone for the first time since the gala. You think you're very clever, don't you? Victoria's voice was ice cold. I think I'm prepared, Margaret replied calmly. You invited me here to embarrass myself, and I chose not to accommodate you. Victoria's laugh was bitter. This was just the beginning, dear. The board meeting was child's play compared to what's coming. Wait until you have to navigate the Patterson Foundation charity auction next week. Wait until you're forced to make small talk with women who've been planning their daughters' debutante balls since birth. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Wait until you discover that all the studying in the world can't wash the poverty stench off your skin or make these people forget what you really are. Margaret met Victoria's gaze like a queen facing a rebellion, calm, unshakable, already knowing how this story ends. Mrs. Sterling, I've spent my entire life in worlds that weren't meant for me. I've learned that the people who build barriers are usually afraid of what happens when those barriers come down. She gathered her notes and stood to leave, pausing at the door for one final comment. Thank you for today's lesson in corporate governance. I found it very educational. As Margaret walked back through the marble lobby, she felt the adrenaline of victory coursing through her veins. She had survived her first major test, not just survived but succeeded in ways that clearly frustrated Victoria's plans. But she also understood that this was just the opening skirmish in a much longer war. Victoria Sterling had spent decades perfecting the art of social destruction, and she wouldn't be caught off guard again. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David. How did it go? She typed back, round one to me, but the fight's just getting started. As she drove back through Richmond's affluent neighborhoods, Margaret allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had walked into the lion's den and emerged with her dignity intact and new allies in her corner. But Victoria Sterling was already planning her counterattack. That evening, Victoria made a series of phone calls to the city's most influential social gatekeepers. The Patterson Foundation charity auction would be Margaret's next test, and Victoria intended to make sure it was significantly more challenging than today's boardroom triumph. Margaret Washington had won this battle through preparation and intelligence. But the next battle would require something even more difficult: learning to navigate the treacherous waters of high society social politics while maintaining her dignity and authentic self. The war was far from over. In her small apartment that night, Margaret spread out information about the Patterson Foundation and Virginia's charity circuit. She had 6 days to prepare for an environment where the weapons were gossip and exclusion, where one social misstep could be weaponized into evidence of her unworthiness. But as she studied seating charts and guest lists, Margaret smiled grimly. Victoria Sterling thought she understood Margaret's limits. She was about to discover that Margaret Washington had no limits, only challenges she hadn't conquered yet. The next phase of her transformation was about to begin. 6 months later, Margaret Washington stood in the same Crystal Bay Country Club ballroom where her life had changed forever. But this time, everything was different. The scared 19-year-old server had been forged into something unbreakable. Steel wrapped in silk, power draped in grace. Margaret wore an emerald green gown that made her dark skin glow like a goddess. Every curve, every angle declaring that she belonged in palaces, not serving them. Her natural hair was styled in an elaborate updo that had taken her stylist 3 hours to perfect. Diamond earrings, a graduation gift from David, caught the light as she moved through the crowd with practiced grace. The past 6 months had been warfare disguised as education. Every gala a battle, every board meeting a siege, every social event a calculated conquest. Margaret had not only survived the Patterson Foundation charity auction, she had raised more money than any other attendee by proposing a scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing medical careers. She had navigated 3 different charity galas, served on 2 nonprofit boards, and even convinced the Richmond Museum of Fine Arts to host an exhibition celebrating African American contributions to Virginia's cultural heritage. More importantly, she had maintained her authentic self throughout every trial. Instead of trying to become someone else, Margaret had shown high society that their world needed her perspective, her intelligence, and her passion for helping others. Tonight was the reckoning. The same 300 guests who had witnessed Victoria's cruel challenge 6 months ago had gathered to see its resolution. What had started as bloodthirsty certainty in her destruction had become shocked reverence for the phoenix rising from their ashes. What had started as unanimous certainty in her failure had become genuine anticipation of an unprecedented social revolution. David stood beside Margaret, his pride evident in every gesture. Over the past 6 months, their love had been tested in fires that would have melted weaker metals and emerged as pure gold. They had built something real through late-night conversations about medicine and philosophy, through shared volunteer work at the Children's Hospital, through David's patient support as Margaret navigated each new social challenge. Victoria Sterling entered the ballroom like Napoleon returning from exile, magnificent in defeat, terrifying in her refusal to surrender. The pharmaceutical heiress had watched Margaret's meteoric rise through Richmond society with growing alarm and, though she would never admit it, grudging respect. Every trap Victoria had set had become a platform for Margaret to shine brighter. Every attempt to isolate her had resulted in Margaret building new alliances with people Victoria had considered unshakable loyalists. But Victoria Sterling had not built an empire by accepting defeat gracefully. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "6 months ago we witnessed an unusual wager. Tonight we determine its outcome." The crowd gathered in a circle around Margaret and Victoria, the same formation that had witnessed their original confrontation. But the energy was completely different now. Where there had once been cruel anticipation of Margaret's humiliation, there was now genuine curiosity about how this unprecedented social drama would conclude. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her expression complex. 6 months ago, she had been Victoria's most loyal ally in attempting to destroy Margaret. But Margaret's grace under pressure and genuine accomplishments had forced even her harshest critics to reassess their positions. "Miss Washington," Mrs. Patterson said formally, "the consensus among Richmond society is that you have met every challenge presented to you with remarkable success." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Margaret hadn't just survived high society, she had tamed the lions and made them purr. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. Success in individual events does not constitute true acceptance. The question was whether Miss Washington could prove she belongs in our world permanently, not whether she could perform adequately when under scrutiny. "Then let's ask the people who matter," Margaret said quietly. "This is all very inspiring," Victoria said icily. "But it doesn't change the terms of our original agreement. The question was whether you could prove you belong in our world, not whether you could improve it." Margaret walked directly to Victoria, stopping just inches away. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "Mrs. Sterling, I spent 6 months proving I could play your games. But the real truth, your approval was never the prize. Your approval was the consolation gift I didn't even want." She paused, letting the weight of her accomplishments settle on the room. "But the most important thing I've learned is that I don't need your approval to be worthy. I don't need your world to validate my existence. I never did." Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. "Then you're admitting defeat?" "I'm declaring victory on my own terms." Margaret turned to David, who stepped forward with wonder and love shining in his eyes. "David Sterling, 6 months ago you asked me to marry you in front of all these people. I told you then that I needed to know I could stand beside you as an equal. Now I know I can stand beside you, in front of you, or completely on my own." She smiled, her joy radiating through the ballroom. "So yes, I'll marry you. Not because I've proven myself to your mother or to Richmond society, but because I love you and I know exactly who I am." The crowd exploded like a dam bursting, years of suppressed admiration flooding free, drowning Victoria's cruelty and thunderous approval. David swept Margaret into his arms, spinning her around as the entire ballroom celebrated their engagement. But Victoria Sterling wasn't finished. "Wait," she called out, her voice cutting through the celebration. "The terms of our agreement have been fulfilled," Margaret interrupted, turning back to face her future mother-in-law one last time. "You challenged me to prove I belong in your world. I've done that and more. I've shown that your world is better with me in it." She walked back to Victoria, extending her hand just as she had 6 months earlier. "Mrs. Sterling, you owe me an apology, publicly." As agreed, the ballroom fell silent again, everyone waiting to see whether Victoria Sterling would honor the terms of her own wager. Victoria stared at that outstretched hand like it was a snake offering poison, knowing that accepting meant swallowing her pride, refusing meant admitting she was a liar. Her pride writhed like a dying animal, while something she hadn't felt in decades, genuine respect, rose from the ashes of her assumptions. Finally, Victoria took Margaret's hand. "Miss Washington," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, "I owe you an apology. I underestimated your intelligence, your character, and your strength. You have not only proven yourself worthy of the sterling name, you have shown us what it truly means to have class and dignity." She paused, her voice softening slightly. "I was wrong about you. And I was wrong about what my son needed in a partner. You are exactly what our family needs to grow and improve." The applause that followed was thunderous. Margaret smiled with the grace of queens granting pardons to failed assassins. "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling. I look forward to being part of your family." As the evening continued around them, Margaret and David found a quiet moment on the ballroom's balcony, looking out over the city lights of Richmond. "Any regrets?" David asked softly. Margaret considered the question seriously. "Only one. I wish my grandmother could have been here to see this. She always told me that barriers were just opportunities in disguise." David took her hand, the engagement ring sparkling between them. "She did see it. Every choice you made, every challenge you conquered, she was there." As they rejoined the celebration, Margaret Washington, soon to be Margaret Sterling, reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had entered this ballroom 6 months ago as a server who was invisible to the wealthy elite. She was leaving as someone who had not only gained their respect, but had inspired them to be better than they thought possible. The fairy tale was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The Richmond Rising Foundation would rise like a tidal wave, washing away decades of "we've always done it this way" and drowning excuses in opportunity. High society had been conquered by a 19-year-old girl with nothing but brains, dignity, and the audacity to believe she deserved better. And somewhere in the ballroom, a young black server watched Margaret's triumph and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, the belief that maybe, just maybe, she could be next. The barriers weren't just falling, they were being demolished by women who refused to accept that no was a permanent answer. And Margaret Washington had just handed them the blueprints for revolution.